Here's another instance of priming that has a really deep impact on how we make judgments of others. This is one of the first studies, in fact, probably the first study on priming in social psychology. And what they did is they presented participants with words related to either recklessness or adventurousness. This was in the context of some other memory procedure that was apparently different from the study they would eventually participate in. But the idea here is that during activity number 1 in the study, the words people were dealing with were either the ones on the top, which included words like reckless, careless, heedless, rash, etc., or they were the words on the bottom, which included words like adventurous, risk-taker, traveler, self-confident, daring, free-spirited, and so forth. Each of which converges on a different schema, either a schema of recklessness or of adventurousness. And just by doing this memory activity, one of those schemas was primed more than the other, depending on which set of words people had been randomly given. After that first activity, they were given a short description of someone named Donald, who was described ambiguously in a way that could suggest recklessness or adventurousness. Here's what that might have looked like. It's actually a longer passage, but this gives you the gist. Donald has climbed Mount McKinley, shot the Colorado Rapids in a kayak, driven in a demolition derby, and piloted a jet-powered boat without knowing very much about boats. Here, you might see that Donald is reckless, given this behavior, but you also could interpret the very same paragraph as being a description of someone who's just adventurous. Depends upon how you want to interpret things. And what they did is they presented this to people after one of those two categories had been primed in the memory procedure, and then they asked, how much do you like Donald? If you see Donald as being reckless, you're likely to like him less than if you see him as being more adventurous, which is a more positive quality. And here's what they find. When they look at people's ratings of Donald, they differ pretty dramatically based only on a random difference in the words they got at the beginning of the study. If people had memorized a lot of words which included recklessness-type words, they later said they liked Donald less than people who had initially memorized words that included adventurousness-related words. Just priming one category of words over another changed the way that people interpreted that paragraph about Donald. It made them see it as totally different from one condition to the next, which ultimately had an impact on how much they liked him. Here's another classic study demonstrating priming effects, and this Barge, Chen, and Burroughs 1996 study has become very popular for illustrating behavioral priming, a way in which priming can have a direct impact on how people behave as a consequence. So here's what they did. They primed the concept of the elderly. So here's a case in which there was stereotype priming, and they wanted to see the impact this had on a direct behavioral measure. But the way they primed concepts of the elderly was they gave people a sentence unscramble task. Earlier we did a word unscramble. This is a sentence unscramble where you get a list of individual words and you reorganize them to make a sensible sentence. But here's the key point to consider. The sentences that people were unscrambling during this part of the study either had words in them that primed elderly stereotypes, words like Florida, sentimental, wise, bingo, etc., or they contained words that were not related to the elderly. So people were doing sentence unscramble tasks that in general are no different from one another, but they either contained these words that primed an elderly schema or not. And then they measured in a really sneaky way how long it took these participants to leave the building. They said, okay, your study is over. All you have to do is just walk down the hallway and you'll see the door that allows you to leave. And all they did was measure how long did it take people to walk down the hallway, imagining that if you're in an elderly mindset, you'll walk more slowly and take longer to get to the end of a hall. Sounds crazy, but in fact, that's what they find. Compared to the condition where people got neutral words in their sentence unscramble, the people who got elderly words in their sentence unscramble took longer to walk from one end of the hall to the next. Just a simple priming procedure having a deep impact on behavior, because when one schema comes to mind, it influences and biases your subsequent decisions and behaviors. So in summary, we apply the schema that's most accessible in a given moment, and those schemas can be made accessible via procedures like priming, which mean that in an environment that you're in, you may have one schema come to mind more readily than another, and that subtle difference could have a big impact on your choices.